Strategy, A History by Lawrence Freedman, Oxford. Page 198, Attrition and Maneuver. Boyd's writings led to the evaluation of strategies in terms of their ability to cause uncertainty and confusion in the enemy's mind. This could be achieved by undermining the will to fight, moral warfare, encouraging distorted perception of reality, by either deception or attacks on means of communication, mental warfare, and using the advantages gained to attack war-making capacities so the enemy could not survive, physical warfare. The prescriptions that flowed from analysis of the first strategy were largely derivative of the post-Napoleonic classics and of Fuller and Liddell Hart. One of Boyd's key examples was the 1940 Battle of France, which prompted his blitzkrieg versus Maginot Line mentality. French decision-making was paralyzed as the Germans worked out how to operate inside their OODA loops. One key to German success was the readiness to delegate. Tactical commanders could realize the mission in their own way. This depended on a shared understanding of what needed to be done. Boyd distinguished between attrition warfare, focused on the physical domain and using firepower as a destructive force, and maneuver warfare focused on the mental domain, where the aim was to generate surprise and shock by using ambiguity, mobility, and deception. Blitzkrieg could also lead to effects in the moral domain, which Boyd saw as being related to menace and uncertainty. The example was not chosen at random. It played into a major debate then underway on the future of American military policy. The setting of the 1970s was one in which the armed forces of the United States were still licking their Vietnam-imposed wounds and coming to terms with the implications of an all-volunteer army. The generals believed that they could rebuild the army best by focusing on the priority task of securing NATO's central front. This had the added advantage of returning to the comfort zone of preparations for major war and away from insurgencies. In addition, since the 1960s, American policymakers had indicated a wish to reduce dependence on nuclear deterrence as it involved increasingly incredible threats. In this respect, the latter stages of Vietnam and the 1970 Arab-Israeli War had indicated that there might be new possibilities, notably technologies that allowed conventional munitions to be delivered with extraordinary precision, offering opportunities to rethink land warfare doctrine. At the same time, there were concerns that the European challenge had become greater than before. The Warsaw Pact was presumed to still enjoy substantial numerical superiority, but also to have revamped its doctrine and built up its strength, while the Americans had been preoccupied with Vietnam. The resentment of McNamara's managerialism at the Pentagon still ran deep, and was reflected in much of the critical literature of the time. He was taken to embody the stifling introduction of conformist practices and the risk-averse culture of large corporations into a business that should really honor warrior virtues and cultivate mavericks. This became another version of the romantic lament against bureaucratization and scientific rationality. Although the trends in scientific thinking around complexity encouraged the view that it was the rationalists who were now being overtaken, it also challenged a military elite who had bought into the corporatist culture. Desk-bound and far from the scenes of actual conflict, they were as proud of their degrees in business administration and economics as they were forgetful of the ways of military strategy. The first fruits of the Army's post-Vietnam reappraisal of doctrine came with the 1976 publication of Field Manual 100-5 Operations, the Army's main doctrinal manual. The manual drew on the lethality of modern weaponry, bringing all forms of firepower, land and air, to bear in a combined arms approach in order to generate an active defense. It was a traditional approach, dependent on the most advanced equipment and professional training to produce a force capable of holding lines against a determined offensive and inflicting crippling damage on the enemy until they were so weak they could not cope with a counterattack. It did not take long before this manual was subjected to a searing critique. This was as much about reforming the whole military establishment as addressing a difficult conundrum about how to think about NATO's central front. The criticism originated not from within the military establishment, but from a group of largely civilian defense specialists, though many had military backgrounds and were influeed by Boyd. To the fore in the attack was William Lind, intensely conservative though he was, working as a legislative aide to a Democratic senator. Boyd's dichotomy between attritional and maneuver warfare, using the Maginot Line versus Blitzkrieg analogy, was picked up with some vigor by Lind, who had a keen interest in German fighting methods. In contrast to attrition, which has the objective of killing enemy troops or destroying enemy equipment, the Blitzkrieg-based alternative of maneuver would have as its primary objective breaking the spirit and will of the opposing high command by creating unexpected and unfavorable operational or strategic situations. Within 5 years, the reformers had apparently won the argument, with the adoption of the doctrine of air-land battle in 1982 and a revised Army Field Manual. This was intended from the start to set broad principles for any war, not just one in Europe. The battlefield was to be seen in the round, and the critical attributes of successful operations were stressed as initiative, depth, agility, and synchronization. For Field Manual 100-5, maneuver was the dynamic element of combat, allowing the concentration of forces to use surprise, psychological shock, position, and momentum to enable smaller forces to defeat larger ones. It was seen as the employment of forces through movement, supported by fire, to achieve a position of advantage from which they could then destroy or threaten to destroy the enemy. The aim was to move fast, probe defenses, and exploit success, carrying the deep battle into the enemy's rear. The spirit was offensive and in line with Boyd's determination to get inside the enemy's OODA loop. The underlying purpose of every encounter, quote, with the enemy is to seize or retain independence of action. To do this, we must make decisions and act more quickly than the enemy to disorganize his forces and to keep him off balance, end quote. By 1986, the Field Manual 90-8 counter-guerrilla operations, dealing with action directed against armed anti-government forces, claimed that the basic concept of airline battle doctrine can be applied to counter-guerrilla operations. In 1989, the Marine Corps issued FM-FM-1, which insisted that its doctrine was based on warfare by maneuver, which would provide a means to defeat a physically superior foe by rendering the enemy incapable of resisting, by shattering his moral and physical cohesion.